Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the glistening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. These are the powerful words of Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem. Hello, everyone. My name is Soribel Henao, and I am so excited and proud to welcome you to our 2021 Black History Celebration. As one of the inaugural Diversity Fellows, Professor of Educational Leadership, and member of the Black and Latinx Faculty and Staff Association, we welcome you. Without each and every member, this would not be possible. Thank you, BLFSA. I am thrilled to be part of such an important endeavor at Queens College. Our theme, Sankofa, reminds us that in order to understand our present and ensure our future, we must know our past. Today, we welcome you to learn, be a part of our history beyond February. We look forward to an amazing program. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chanel George. I'm a counselor in the Percy E. Seton Speak program here at Queens College. I'm honored to introduce our presenter for this segment of the Black History Month programming at Queens College. He is Professor Francois Pierre-Louis. He is a professor in the Political Science Department at Queens College, CUNY. His research interests have included topics like immigration, transnationalism, and Haitian and Caribbean politics. In 1991, he served in the private cabinet of President Jean-Bertrand Aristide and on the senior staff of Prime Minister Jacques-Edouard Alexis from 2007 to 2008. He is also the co-editor of Immigration Crossroads, Globalization, Incorporation, and Placemaking in Queens, New York. And in 2006, he authored Haitians in New York City, Transnationalism and Hometown Association. His articles have been featured in various publications, including U.S. Catholics, Wadabajii, the Journal of Haitian Studies in Education and Urban Society, the Journal of Health, Human Services Administration, the Journal of Latin American Perspectives, and as well as the Journal of Black Studies. In 2011 to 2016, he served the Chancellor of the City University of New York as the Senior Advisor of the Haiti CUNY programs. We are honored to have him present today on the topic of revisiting the Haitian Revolution in the era of Black Lives Matter.
Thank you, Chanel, for this nice introduction. And I'd like to also thank the organizing committee of the BLFSA and the administration on campus, President Wu, Provost Henry, and Professor Sori Bell, Genaro, and all the other members of the committee that made this possible. Because Black History Month is very important for the college. It's very, very important for all of us who live in the United States. And as Sori Bell said, it's not cannot only be celebrated in a short month, but we are trying to do our best to remind everyone of the contribution of the African American people to America. So my talk today is revisiting the Haitian Revolution in the era of Black Lives Matter. So the reason I chose this title is because I think it's fitting to understand the role of the Haitian Revolution in building the consciousness and in exposing the horror of slavery, especially in the 1800s, and what contributed to the liberation of um, Haitians. Haiti, basically the Haitian Revolution changed the outlook on slavery. Haiti was the richest colony of France. Slavery was based on the idea that blacks were inferior to whites and they could not take care of themselves. So when these slaves defeated the greatest army on earth in 1804, the army of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Haitians demonstrated that blacks were equal to white. The heroic action of the slaves like Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and the battles they engaged in at that moment was really fitting in the sense that no one expected these slaves to have contributed so much to changing the course of humanity. It is important to understand the impact of the Haitian Revolution on humanity. It's because until, since the revolution, there has been this systematic effort to suppress the contribution of these heroes and the slaves who fought in the revolution. For example, just recently, there was a historian who was on the WNYC speaking about history, and he mentioned that the Haitian Revolution happened because they had yellow fever in Haiti, therefore denying the heroic struggle of the slaves to change that revolution. So the other thing that's important to understand the impact of the revolution was that from historical memory in the United States, all the African Americans, all the slaves, the young people who were opposing this brutal system, always look at the Haitian Revolution as a way forward. For example, when Nat Turner began his old slave rebellion, the reference was Haiti. In Philadelphia, every January 1st, the churches would celebrate the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines were heroes that were taught to African American blacks about their contribution to changing the slavery system. When the revolution took place in Haiti, the slave owners in the South, the Americans, were so afraid that this would go to the South also, that they began to change a series of laws, a series of process in order to restrict the slaves and to keep the slaves from knowing about the revolution. The revolution did not only stay in Haiti, but it was throughout the Caribbean. Everyone was afraid that there would have been some changes, there would have been some impact in the slavery system and how it was structured. So that's why the importance of this revolution in Haiti really changed the course of history.
Thank you so much for that, Francois. I think those are such poignant points in terms of looking at the historical context of what happened in Haiti and how this relates to us today. As we know, Haiti was one of the richest colonies in France. So talk to us today a little bit about what are some of the primary barriers that exist to the emergence of maybe having a stable post-slavery society after the 1800s?
Well, Chanel, I would say as soon as the revolution took place. You take a leader like Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture did not really want to completely sever relations with France. Toussaint, thinking of the French Declaration on Human Rights, where they talk about 1789, all men are equal, all men and women, and therefore Toussaint thought, having such a great, being a general, having such a great revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte would accept him as a governor of the island, and there wouldn't be slavery. But as soon as the revolution took place, the systematic effort was to make sure that Haiti would be isolated. Haiti would be isolated because he is undermining white supremacy. The loss of France's richest colony not only led to having Napoleon selling the Louisiana territory to America, but it also created a fear that if Haiti began to develop, if Haiti become prosperous, if Haiti really becomes this kind of society where the first constitution that was structured by the Haitian government recognized the humanity of everyone by stating that if you were a black person, if you are a slave person who came to Haiti after the revolution, you were granted citizenship automatically. Haiti was the first country in the world that really put in practice the idea of universal human rights. The other thing that was important and that made everyone afraid of the Haitian Revolution, and they tried to boycott it. For example, the United States, Jefferson wrote several texts, memos about the reason we cannot accept, they cannot accept the Haitian Revolution. First, it would be a bad example for the slave-owning society. Secondly, it would show that white supremacy was not standing on its ground because it was defeated by Haiti. And third, they could never thought of seeing blacks as their equal. So what they did is that not only they created laws in America to restrict the slaves, but they made sure that no other country could negotiate, could open diplomatic relations with Haiti. The other thing that they did at that time, which undermined Haiti's economy, France forced Haiti to pay an indemnity for declaring independence. That debt that Haiti was paying up till the 19th century basically decimated Haiti's economy, in the sense that all the revenue that could have gone for development, transportation, infrastructure work, all that money went toward paying France. So Haiti is the only country in the whole world that paid twice for its independence. First, by shedding the blood of the slaves to gain that independence. Secondly, having been boycotted by every nation in the world, they had to pay France to be recognized so that they can negotiate, they can be in the world market again. So as a result, when we are today see the Haiti in such a situation, we have to go back into history and realize, my God, look, a country that shed its blood, that contributed so much to ending white supremacy, was punished by such. The other thing that happens is that all these countries wanted to make sure that the example of Haiti would never happen again in anywhere in the world, especially in the Caribbean and in the South. In fact, there was this whole comment in the Caribbean when Martinique, Guadeloupe wanted to gain their independence. The French would tell them, "Oh, you want to be like Haiti." They begin giving that, well, if you decide to go against us, we're going to make you pay for it, and you're going to pay dearly.
Wow.
So therefore, that's why when we see the instability going on, it is in the interest of these countries to keep Haiti unstable. Because the minute Haiti becomes stable, it defeated white supremacists, it undermines the whole system of exploitation that was based on the taking advantage of other human beings.
Wow, wow. And I think it's so important that we understand what the threats and the challenges to white supremacy are. And I think you started to have that conversation. You also mentioned a few leaders that as we've looked at how they influenced the revolution, we can see Leventil and Dessalines. They had two very different leadership styles and two very different approaches to leading the revolution. So can you talk with us today? What are some of those tenets of activism, and how can we apply some of those to maybe when we are looking in the broader scheme of things when it comes to white supremacy?
Yeah. Well, Dessalines was a field slave. Dessalines was a slave that was tortured, brutalized. Toussaint was what they call a house slave. He could read, he was educated, he understood certain things. So Toussaint was more closer to understanding the French way, whereas Dessalines, the way he saw the French was the brutal aspect of slavery and the French system. So Toussaint thought that by being the governor, by being educated, France would have accepted him, and he would be in agreement to negotiating with France in order to keep the colony going under the control of France. So Bonaparte, to his general called Leclerc, tricked Toussaint, arrested him, and took him to France in order to end this whole revolution. When that took place, Dessalines, who never really trusted the French, because knowing what he went through to the state of slavery, Dessalines took over the leadership after that. So while Toussaint was more like a diplomat trying to deal with the French, Dessalines said, you know what? These people will never let us free. If their economy, if their system, hierarchy system depends on us to show us always being at the bottom, and they're stepping on us, they're putting their feet on our neck, they will never allow us to be free. So therefore, to be free, we have to fight differently than Toussaint was fighting. As a result, what Dessalines said, we gotta get the army back again, mobilize ourselves, depend on ourselves, don't depend on the French collaboration or anybody else. And then when we fight them off, then we kick them off the island, kick the whites off the island, take over our own territory. That's when we can have our independence. So in those days, Dessalines was more radical than Toussaint. And Dessalines understood that when you're having a revolution and you're changing a system, you cannot have it halfway. Now, unfortunately, all the French that fled the island, they went to Louisiana, they came to the United States, they began to have a bad rap about Dessalines. You see, we have to understand in the context, when the enemy, you overthrow the enemy, they can never like you. They can never accept the fact that they've lost their privilege and they've lost their wealth that they built as a result of your hard labor. So they began to have a bad propaganda against Haiti. They began to have a bad propaganda against Dessalines. And for many times, in many history books, Dessalines was portrayed as a bad guy, even though he was the one who finally gave Haitians their independence.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So I like you also mentioned the concept of white supremacy taking on different forms, right? And laws that restrict the movements of slave after a specific period of time. Can you transition us into talking about the Haitian Revolution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Why is that important, and what is the connection to one's humanity?
We are all human beings, right? That's what the Bible said. Race, which has become a major issue in 20th century, 21st century, was something that was created to justify slavery. Because how could you be a Christian, a religious person, you are, talking all the time, preaching all the time about the equality under God, and at the same time, you're subhumanizing some people. So what happened is that for white supremacists to survive, they have to have some people at the bottom. So blacks, slaves, African Americans, people of color became those at the bottom. So when Haiti became independent, the first thing Haiti did was to suppress that, get rid of that. First, by declaring that everyone is equal under the law. And Haiti came with a constitution that did not recognize people's race. For example, in Haiti, it doesn't matter what color you were Haitian. It wasn't like, you were white Haitian, black Haitians, or blue eyes, or green eyes. You were Haitian. So the minute that was recognized, there was no difference on the question of color. That's the first time you are recognizing the person's humanity. The second thing also, Haitians truly understood the idea that you have to suppress, destroy slavery, not only in Haiti, but everywhere else. When Simon Bolivar, who was the leader in Venezuela, in Latin America, fighting to get rid of the Spanish Empire, right? They came to Haiti to get weapons. Haiti gave them weapons, Haiti gave them money, and Haiti said to them, one condition, we are arming you, we are giving you all these things, is that the minute you liberate any territory from Spain, the first thing you have to do is free the slaves. Because slavery was the number one issue, because that's how you make a difference between people's humanity and others. So Haiti really understood that idea of equality, that idea of not discriminating against race, and also realizing that everyone has that potential. And that's it was important because at that time, so 1789, the French had this nice declaration of human rights, right? Omena created the code. They have this great revolution. But at the same time, they did not want to give up the colonies that made them wealthy. And Haiti was really the problem for them, because Haiti was showing their hypocrisy in saying, okay, we are all human beings, at the same time, you're enslaving others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks. Wow. And this kind of moves us to the point, right? We see a lot of shifts happening here when we look at the revolution, when we look at the implications to human rights and the concept of humanity. And now we're thinking of isolation, right? The separation, this place is all by itself. Talk to us a little bit about how that has related to historically to where the country is and where it was in terms of isolation.
Yes, you see that beautiful citadel that is being projected here. This citadel was built under the leadership of King Henri Christophe, who took over after the Descendants was assassinated. These people who had the revolution, the revolutionaries, right? They understood that in order for Haitians to maintain their independence, they have to be independent at every level. Economically, socially, culturally, politically, and they have to have a strong army. So the citadel, these forts were built all over the country. to prepare in case that Napoleon wanted to come back, invade Haiti, and took over. Now, the reason it is important to show this structure, the Citadel, is because one of the propaganda that was put throughout the world was that Haitians or Black people cannot achieve much. You see, until today, the idea is that white supremacy is based on the idea that we have to do for you because you cannot do for yourself. The Citadel was a symbol of look what we could do, and we had citadels like that all over the country. People sacrificed their lives, sacrificed everything to build these things to protect their independence and their liberty. They understood their freedom had no price to it. If you are a human being, and what defines you as a human being is the freedom of movement. As you can see, every time white supremacists, the idea of controlling those that are weaker is at the roots of white supremacists. In other words, make you powerless, make you unable to fend for yourself, make you totally dependent to a point where you cannot defend yourself. So the founding fathers of the Haitian Revolution understood that. So they built forts, they encourage agriculture to develop in a way people can eat and support themselves. They supported a lot of education in the North, had one of the best education systems at that time, because they understood that to be free is to be able to take things into your own hands.
Thank you for that. It seems like Haitian history is ingrained with people who are resilient. Talk to us about what that resilience means to their identity.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question too, because sometimes people talk about resilience in the sense that, you know, it's because people are powerless and they resign themselves. But in the case of the Haitian people, resilience is about, we know why you are against us, and we're not going to let you win that fight. We know you never agree with us for the fact that we're the first Black republic in the world, and we didn't ask you permission to do it. So therefore, how are we going to show our resilience? The first thing is through culture. Culture is very important to show resilience. Haitians practice voodoo, right? Voodoo was part of the struggle against slavery. The Catholic Church came to Haiti, and they tried everything possible to destroy the Haitian religion called voodoo. You know, they went into the temples and destroyed artifacts, the symbols. They told people it's a sin to practice voodoo. Every Haitian has some voodoo understanding of what voodoo is. And that's what kept the culture in terms of resilience and structure. Resilience also is the case of symbols, right? For example, January 1st, that was the first time Haitians in 1804 took their independence. Every Haitian household, it doesn't matter whether you live in Haiti, whether you live in the diaspora, you would have your subjumu. You know, people don't even understand what subjumu is, but it was a symbol that I can be free. You know why Haitians have that subjumu? It's because when they were slaves, subjumu was reserved only for the white colonialists, the slave owners. Slaves were not allowed to have that. So the first day on January 1st, every slave became free. Everyone had their subjumu. It was a symbol of freedom, a symbol of resilience. And this has passed from generation to generation. And if you go on the internet, you Google subjumu, You find out so many chefs, so many cooks, so many people in the 21st century is still celebrating the subjumu. The other thing that's important in understanding our resilience is the fact that it's very rare to see a Haitian who's successful, who doesn't claim their Haitian roots or where they came from. I'm fascinated by Naomi Osaka. He's a young girl whose father is Haitian, right? Who decided that, you know what? I'm going not to show that I'm Japanese Haitian or I'm Japanese American. I'm going to show my Haitianness. She didn't have to. But I think it's the resiliency, the understanding of what freedom is all about. What is it to be human that push her to do something like that? When we had the World Cup soccer game, right? Here we are, Wycliffe Jean, in Berlin for the World Cup. What he dared to do was to have a Haitian flag or as his bandana, even though he wasn't even singing Creole, but to show that, you know what, we are here to stay. We're going to stay despite all the odds. And to tell you the truth, we've had a lot of odds since the revolution. But people try to maintain that. And I think what has happened also over time, it doesn't matter what those people are. Like you take someone like Jason Pierre-Paul, GPP, right? Who is now with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They always try to show, you know what, no matter where we are in the world, we belong to a historical part. It's a question of identity. To me, we go back to the idea of white supremacists and understanding what white supremacists is. White supremacists, you don't have an identity. We don't know who you are. And if you don't not grounded into something that you can belong to, you cannot make progress. Everyone is interested in understanding their identity, where they came from, how did they come here. Every society, every group has a myth, right? The Japanese have their own myth of the Sun people, right? The Chinese have their own. You know, the Jews have their own. Native Americans have their own. In other words, what grounded you is your identity. Or to me, when you have an identity, then you can have a sense of understanding of who you are and where you're going and what you have to do. And to me, that's the essence of understanding the resiliency of Haitians.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, as you were talking about culture and as you were talking about the food and the national dish and how it was celebrated, I think it's so important to also remember, you know, different cultural influences. So talk to us, you talked to us about Wyclef Jean, you talked to us about JPP, and you talked to us about the soup. Tell us more about some cultural influences that are part of this history of this great nation, and why is it also significant to humanity as well as this concept of identity of which you speak?
Yeah, Chanel, you know, you started this program with the song of Bookman Experience, Kempasote.
Yes.
Right? Haitians as well as Americans and people from different places in the world know about that kind of music. They're called woods music, right? It's a sense of music that is unique in terms of what it projects. And I think when you look at the influence of the Haitian community, your Haitian society, that cultural aspect, right? A lot of people go to Haiti. Sometimes people could go to Haiti in terms of to gaze. Oh, we want to gaze the poverty because Haiti is the only country in the world, Chanel, that has a last name. Every time they write about Haiti, they say the poorest country in the hemisphere.
Wow.
You know, this is to remind people, oh, you guys had that revolution. You know, remember you are poor. Whereas that's not really true. What happened is that when they give you that last name, is to deny who you are. So I think in that sense, when people go to Haiti and they realize the resiliency of the people, their cultural contribution to humanity, their historical contribution, and the fact that they can understand freedom in a way where it is not, poverty doesn't define you. Poverty can do two things. It can bring you down totally, or it can make you more resilient and fight against the forces that make you poor. Because poverty is not something that comes from, through God. It's through a system that is established to keep you poor. So with that, you have the people, when they go to Haiti, they understand that, look, if poverty existed like this in the United States or other countries, there would have been total chaos, anarchy, ransack in those countries. Whereas in Haiti, people are going around their business very peacefully, but understanding that there are forces that are beyond them, that they cannot fight right away, but they're going to resist in however way they can. And this is when people go to Haiti, they pick up these things, they go back home and get threatened. An example I can give you: Sean Penn, for a long time, was very depressed in California. The guy has everything he needs, wealth, everything he wanted. And he wanted to find himself. He ended up going to Haiti to find himself. By realizing, you know what, all these things I have in Southern California, all the things I had at my disposal, I'm still unhappy. Whereas I ended up in Haiti, I'm very happy, and I don't need to use all of these things. So in other words, Haiti became like an anchor to understand the true self of the human being, and how people can understand what freedom is and what liberty is all about.
You mentioned a lot about why understanding this historical context is important for us now, right? I think oftentimes we hear about traditions, we hear about what countries have gone through, and we're not able to make those connections in real time, right? Prior to when you began our conversation today, and you talked so much about the empires and the systems and white supremacy and all these systems that have held people, the Haitian people, captive, and so for many people who were part of this Atlantic slave trade. Tell us a little bit. To what extent has the Haitian Revolution impacted the Atlantic slave trade during that period, and what does it have to do with Frederick Douglass?
Well, great. Frederick Douglass was the first U.S. ambassador to Haiti after the Civil War. The United States always had a problem with its slaves, African Americans. They didn't know what to do with them. For Jefferson, they had to send everybody to Africa, back to Africa. In fact, a lot of slaves went back to Liberia. Liberia was founded as a result of that. Sierra Leone, because the white society could not understand that they can live peacefully with another race, because the guilt feeling of exploiting for 300 years a group of people, not giving them anything. And once they began asking for it, all they wanted to do was get rid of them. But that was really impossible, because blacks in the United States became part of the nation like any other group. So when Frederick Douglass came to Haiti, at that time you had a lot of other slaves who were either during the war, they were sent to Haiti. You have slaves from the United States that went to Haiti, that went to the Dominican Republic. They set up their own community over there. So Frederick Douglass became the bridge between Haitians and the United States, especially for Black America. But throughout the history of Haiti, as I mentioned before, Black Americans always look at Haiti, not only in terms of its liberation, its cultural aspect. There was a lot of contact between African Americans and Haitian poets, writers, authors. They used to go on Lanston News and all, they used to go back and forth dealing with Haitian leaders, Haitian writers. And, when the US occupied Haiti in the early part of the 20th century, it was the African Americans who lobbied against the occupation, who forced the US to leave Haiti alone. So therefore, you had this whole connection. And the reason, I began and said link it to the Black Lives Matter, The Black Lives Matter is a consciousness raising of African Americans in the US to claim their own agency and challenge white supremacy. You see, white supremacy is a myth of superiority over others. So how do you challenge a myth that has been ingrained in people's mind for over 500 years? You do that by first getting your own agency, and secondly, by showing that, to become, in order to be oppressed, you have to be powerless. And powerlessness is an expression of making you forget who you are. You don't have a history. Many of our African American, my friends, used to joke with me to say, Francois, you have a country. We don't have a country. Because imagine, African Americans have been here longer than many whites. A lot of times they treat them as foreigners, not belonging. And the roots of everything is to belong. When you don't feel belonging, then you become powerless and you're uprooted. You are unable to create your own agency, your own identity. The other thing that's important to me, how I see the Black Lives Matter linked to the Haitian Revolution, is that all the misery, all the difficulties that Haitians are facing in Haiti, right, is linked to the fact that Black people around the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's Europe, or anywhere else, they're at the bottom of the totem pole. If we are a society that's striving for democracy, for the humanity of others, right, the day that Blacks are liberated in the United States, the days that you don't have a white police officer putting his knees on the neck of an African American just because the person is an African American, that's when you're going to have the problems, the troubles that we hear in Haiti. That's when they're going to end too. Because the perception of those that are in power, looking at Haiti, it's a perception that we have to keep these people down the same way the perception is in the United States. So Black Lives Matter is a question of taking on the idea that all men, women are created equal, and taking on the creating a perfect union where, in fact, if you are looking at creating a democratic society in the United States, the Blacks are going to be the one pushing for the democratic society and participation. Because as far as the society right now is established, it works well for white supremacy. It doesn't work well for others. So therefore, they're going to be the agency. They're going to be the agent pushing for the democratic society. And once you have that in the United States, then if you're going to have places like Haiti and other places where Blacks are in power to have a better relationship and better understanding, they will be looked at as equal instead of being people that are separated and being undermined, thinking that they are powerless and nothing can happen with them. So that's why I think the Black Lives Matter also is important to understand in terms of the context of the Haitian Revolution, is that there isn't anyone who can understand the emergence of a new set of ideas without understanding how Black people at the beginning, like the Haitians, the slaves were able to sacrifice themselves for the better of others. You see, when we talk about we think of George Floyd. George Floyd galvanized a movement that was there already, but that was being sidelined. And suddenly that come right into the open. Without George Floyd, you wouldn't have Kamala Harris as vice president. The same way, without the Haitian Revolution, you wouldn't have the United States could have owned all of the part of the Louisiana territory. In other words, what we have contributed in that sense is to understand that anytime you have an oppressed people getting into a struggle and fighting for their own agency, they tend to increase and enlarge the democratic pie and getting everybody in instead of only one group of people.
Wow, I mean, I just love how you just made that connection and made it so clear. And we have so many questions for you in the chat. So I want to get to those questions so that we can get those answers. And our first question is coming from Carol Douglas. And her question is there a move to get France to return to enmity in Haiti? I guess that was the question. Is there a move for that?
Well, I'm glad, Carol, you asked that question, and thank you for putting all this together with the whole team at Queen's College. Yes, in fact, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who who got elected by 70% of the vote the first time in Haiti, and then again the second time, was overthrown in 2004 by the French government because he wanted the reparation from France for having Haitians paid for their independence. The French government literally, Chanel, organized in Haiti, pour a lot of money into Haiti to overthrow Aristide for the fact that he dared ask for reparations.
Wow.
If we were to get the money that we paid to France for our independence, Haiti would have not been as poor as it is now today. So that's why the Black Lives Matter is linked to Haiti in that sense, because the day that African Americans have power in the United States, this question of reparation will come up, not only for African Americans in the US, but also it will be linked to the Caribbean and Haiti. So Jean-Bertrand Aristide lost his power the second time because of that.
Wow. Thank you for that. We also see another question from Soribel, and her question is, please share more about the Citadel's role today.
Thank you, Soribel. The Citadel today is the expression of what Haiti was able to achieve at the time when it was totally isolated by the world. You see, in other words, in front of adversity, in front of isolation, in front of being a pariah to the rest of the world, this is what we could do. Just imagine, had the US established commercial relations with Haiti in 1804. Just imagine, had France, Portugal, Spain, the great empires at that time, who controlled the rest of the world, who had the whole slavery system. Just imagine if they allowed Haiti to do commerce, to trade, to get education, to get infrastructure, what Haiti would have been today. So Haitians are very proud of the Citadel because it represents their past, also what they accomplished in the past, in the adversity of every other and other countries that didn't want them to be independent.
Well, thank you for that. We also have another question here from Alberti. And the question is, can you tell us a little bit about Toussaint Louverture when he was the governor of Saint Dominique, Haiti's name at the time?
Yes. Haiti was called Santo Domingo because it was the Hispaniola island. It was one island. When Haiti gained its independence, it took control over the other half called the Dominican Republic now. Haiti controlled the whole Hispaniola island because the leaders there again. Now that's why understanding these leaders, they understood for Haiti to really stay free, there shouldn't be any slavery on the island at all. So therefore, that's why they took over the eastern part of the island and they occupied what is now Dominican Republic for 25 years. 25 years was under the control of the Haitian leadership, and there was no slavery on the island at all. Toussaint was a genius in his own way, because Toussaint understood, and I think Toussaint understood that you can gain power, but you have to build the economic system and the relational system to maintain that power. You have to remember also the contribution of the slaves to the American Revolution. The Americans fought in Savannah for the American, the Haitians for the Savannah for the American Revolution. So they were fighting as soldiers when they got back to Haiti. They already had some military experience. They were already part of the Spanish army. They were already part of the French army. They supported U.S. Independence, and they realized, gee, if we can do it for the United States, we can do it for ourselves too. So they understand the idea of putting forces together, bringing various groups that did not work with another. And Toussaint was a genius in the same sense that England was fighting with Spain, and England had a common enemy, the United States, because U.S. took its independence. Toussaint was able to divide these people in order for Haiti to maintain its independence. So I think that was the genius of Toussaint Louverture in that sense.
Well, thank you for that. We also have another question here from Elizabeth. She said, or maybe a statement, France does not even teach about Haitian Revolution. The students do not learn about this in their schools. Why do you think that is?
You know what? That's true. They don't teach about Haiti. They don't mention Haiti, because if you can defeat the world's biggest, most important army in 1804 by a group of slaves that you had said they weren't worth anything, and you were exploiting their labor, what kind of big nation you are? In other words, for France to be teaching about Haiti, they have to admit that they weren't as big, as powerful as they thought they were. And secondly, the idea of white supremacists could not hold. If you look at the way empire is built around myth, the white supremacy is a myth that is not only in the United States, it is in England, it is in France, it is everywhere you had slaves. And the fact that you had slaves in all this, and the slaves build the economy, if you take away the white supremacists and you want to continue to exploit people, right, you have to come in with another myth. Or what happened is that in the United States, we had this challenge. The challenge we had in the United States, there was a time white was an exclusive club for only white males who could vote. Women were not included, Irish were not included, Italians were not included, Jews were not included. Over time, they became white, and others became honorary white. But the only group that was always kept at the bottom were African Americans, because the myth of this nation rests on African Americans. So when Black Lives Matter comes in, when you have a revolution in Haiti that undermines that, suddenly they have to find another myth. Or it's very hard in these days to create another myth based on the exploitation of other human beings. So therefore, that's why the French never thought teach anything about the Haitian Revolution in France. In fact, you could ask some French school children where Haiti is located. They don't even know where Haiti is located. This is to the point where Haiti was boycotted by the international community.
Wow. As we wait for more of the comments to come into the chat, I sort of want to take us back to this link that you mentioned before to what's currently happening here in the United States. You also say in your disposition, the Black Lives Matter movement has undertaken a force for America to reckon itself. If Haiti is democratic, developed, and stable, what does this mean for white supremacists? What does it mean for France? What does it mean for all the other countries that had a part to play in creating a system of powerlessness? Not that the people believe that they're powerless, but creating a system where they depleted all of Haiti's resources. Yeah. What would that look like? What would a more democratic state of affairs look like?
The first step, right, to empower people is to give them the economic freedom and the independence. You know, you beg someone, you are at the mercy of someone when that person is going to feed you. Take away that power, then you can decide whatever you want. What I mean by that, the first thing is allow the Haitians to be Haitians. The resources they took away from Haiti, from the indemnity they paid, from the resources they're taking out still today, the taxes, the kind of tariff they have in the system. When you look at the world, the way the world economy is set up, right? With globalization, every other country in the world has become extractive. In other words, you come in, you take the resources, you go away with it, and then you sell them back the finished product. When I teach with my classes with my students, I always tell them the cacao beans come from Ivory Coast, and the best chocolate comes from Switzerland or Belgium. The the bauxite comes from Jamaica, but the airplane is manufactured in Canada and other places, right? The cappuccino machines are made in Italy, but the coffee is coming from Brazil, it's coming from Ethiopia, it's coming from Haiti. Today, to get your independence, countries have to share the technology with you. They're not sharing it out of charity, they're sharing it out of a right. You see, if they refuse to do that, they intend to maintain that situation that you are in, because you cannot become independent without economic power. Economic power means being able to go to school and acquire education, getting into research, getting into science, getting into writing, right? Because writing is an expensive proposition. If you cannot eat, you cannot write, because you have to have time to write. And somebody has to pay your salary for you to have time to write. So if you are every day fending for food and you're living on $2 a day, there is no way you're going to be having time to produce poetry, music, and all these cultural things that make us the human being. Because we human beings, our dimensions is unlimited. If they allowed us to be that. So I think that would be the first thing. Let Haiti be Haiti. Let other countries be other countries in terms of how they take care of their natural resources, their economy, their structure. That doesn't mean they're not going to find help, to get help, but they can choose the help they want, not the help that they want to give you. I think that's the same process. The same way with the African Americans, and I link it to the Black Lives Matter. This is interesting, Chanel. In the United States, COVID-19 affected Black and brown people more than anybody else, right? Suddenly the vaccine came out. Whites were able to get the vaccines more than Blacks. And whites even went to Black communities to get the vaccines, even though the vaccines were reserved to Blacks in those communities. Why is that? First, it's only a question of networking. You are a white person, you are working at the clinic, you call your white friend and said, you know, the vaccine is there, come and get it. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's a question of access. To me, access is very important in life. You cannot act on things that you don't know. When you take a whole population, you take a whole country like Haiti, for almost 200 years, you shut down that country. You don't allow that country to get the right education, the right technology, the right infrastructure. Obviously, they're not going to be reproduced wealth. The same way in our community, understanding the Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter is only about the humanity of that person. It's about the economy of that person also. It's about the knowledge of that person. George Floyd, when you read about George Floyd, right, grew up in the public housing in Houston with no other alternatives than to go out there and hustle. But had he got a good school, resources, he would have been somebody else. So therefore, that's why I think the first step we have to do in our society is to allow those countries, the people in those countries, the ability to be who they are. And to me, those are the fundamentals of being a human being. which to me is at the roots of all these issues we are facing today in the world.
Absolutely. And I believe that blacks have fought for equality and recognition of their humanity for centuries. And as I hear you talk about the role, linking the role of the revolution and how there are different layers of activism, what lessons can we learn about that revolution? What lessons can we learn about activism today as we continue in the fight for racial equity?
To me, there are many lessons, but the first lesson, solidarity. Never think that someone else's problem is only that person's problem. It's our problem as human beings. What made the difference for Black Lives Matter in the summer was the fact that young white people who were not Black began to realize this is beyond a question of color. It's a question of being human beings. Because you won't put your neck on the your knee on the neck of a dog. How could you take a human being and in front of everybody before the camera, you calmly killing that person, and nothing makes you do anything and change your mind? So it's a question of humanity, solidarity, right? The second thing, to me, we have to go beyond the binary black white. The world was never black white. The world is more complicated than a question of color. The third thing that's important to understand is that a lot of times division happens on superficial things instead of fundamental things. Every time people of color, minorities begin to organize themselves, you always have people who come to divide them and keep them divided. And once you are divided, you are unable to achieve your objectives, right? And to me, we're moving into a world today where the world is more divided on the question of resources. Those who have resources and those who don't. And right now, there was a time, because of white supremacy, because of white privilege, whites were automatically given access to a lot of things, and they still have it. But the world is moving to a point where only the super class, those that have money, have access. And those who don't have money, and it doesn't matter whether they're white or black or Latino or brown, they don't have access, they don't have opportunities. So therefore, there needs to be an important role to organize, to bring people around on the basic ideas of they're human, they share the same history, they have the same needs, and people need to come together on that needs instead of just a question of color. And when we do that, you're going to have people coming into a movement beyond a question of color, and there will be a world solidarity, whether it's in Haiti, the United States, or in Africa.
Thank you so much. I think that is what a perfect way to wrap up our segment for today, talking about the importance of solidarity, that my struggle is your struggle. And together, we're able to overcome these systems, but we definitely have to be very strategic about it. We have to remember what the shared interests are, and we have to work together as a community. I think those concepts, those roles, those responsibilities, we have to be able to willing to pull together as a collective to be able to make those systemic changes. So as we close off, Professor Dr. Francois Pierre-Louis, what are your closing thoughts as we close off this segment for today?
Well, first, Queen's College is giving me a lot of hope. The DLFSA, which is new to Queen's College, which is making a difference at Queen's College in bringing a lot of people who were at Queen's College for a long time that I didn't even know. I never got a chance to meet. Secondly, I see even at the level of leadership, President Wood, they're all talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are important words to understand the relationship between equity, question of Black Lives Matter, and access. Because if you don't have access, you cannot move forward. So in my closing statement, I think we have a long way to go, but we are already addressing it. There are going to be a lot of bumps on the road, right? In terms of how do we deal with each other, the language that we use. But the bottom line is that when we look at each other, right, if we share our story, right, we basically have the same history. I'm a professor, and I have someone who works in the janitor section or cleaning section. But we all are looking for a better life, for opportunities, right? We are looking for a fair chance. We are looking for giving opportunities and access so that we can test our faculties. I'm mentioning the word faculty because Madison, when the founding fathers were creating this republic, they said all men had diverse faculties they were born with, right? And the role of government, the role of society is to allow them to express, harness, and develop those faculties. But for the past 200 years, they've allowed only a small minority or a small group of white people expressing, harnessing, accessing those faculties where they kept the others out. And we have realized that when they allow the others to be part of it also, they can achieve good things. A lot of young African Americans growing up in the United States do not know anything about the contribution of African Americans in the US to the US economy, to the scientific contributions. Remember when we had, all these women who sent men into space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those three women, the movie that was made about them, right? Who knew that they were Black women? Who had to do that? People, this other scientists that we never knew about. We are suddenly becoming to know those. The same way that I know that a lot of African American families, right, teach their children about Toussaint Louverture, teach their children about Dessalines, because they wanted them to understand that our past as Black people, right, our past as part of the Atlantic slave trade, there were great people who contributed to changing the course of humanity. But unfortunately, they were not allowed to express themselves. They were not given a platform to do that. And I think what is happening right now, we are getting that platform.
Mm-hmm.
We are getting it. We are expressing our roles. We are becoming part of the leadership and being, so therefore, to have access, you have to be part of the decision makers. If you are not part of the decision makers, you cannot have access. There are certain information you won't never know. So I think all of these things will contribute to this process. And that's why it is important for us to continue topics like Black Lives Matter to discuss, to talk about other great leaders that were in the past contributed to our system that we have, to changing the way humanity was organized.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Francois Pierre-Louis. Join us again tomorrow at 10 a.m. as we talk with Assembly Member Khalil Anderson. And not tomorrow, I'm sorry, Friday. Yes, Friday. I'm so excited. I'm thinking it's tomorrow. Friday. Join us on Friday at 10 a.m. as we talk with Assembly Member Khalil Anderson, and we talk with him about youth activism from a grassroots level. Thank you for tuning in with us, and look forward to the rest of our events for the month.
Thank you.